The oldest photograph of Arles that survives from the 1880s shows a wide, sunlit square with 2 rows of plane trees, a fountain, and almost no people. It looks exactly like the kind of town you go to when you want to disappear into your work and not be bothered, which is, more or less, why Vincent van Gogh got off a train there on the 4th of February, 1888, stepped into 4 inches of unexpected snow, and decided to stay. He was 34. He had been painting seriously for only 5 years. None of this was apparent from what he was producing. In the 9 months between his arrival and the night in question, he completed somewhere between 200 and 240 works canvases, watercolors, drawings at a pace that made even his most sympathetic correspondents worried. He painted the café on the Place du Forum at night. He painted his bedroom, his sunflowers, the Rhône in starlight. He worked outdoors in the mistral wind by strapping his easel to the ground with tent pegs. What he was building, or trying to build, was something he called the Studio of the South, a working collective, a place where painters could live cheaply, share ideas, sustain each other through the long stretches when the work wasn't going and money was short. He wrote to several people about it. Most of them wrote back politely. One of them, in late October, actually arrived. Paul Gauguin was 40 years old, physically imposing, certain of his own talent, in a way that Van Gogh found both compelling and destabilizing. He had a theory of painting that ran in the opposite direction from Van Gogh's, where Van Gogh stood in front of things and painted what he saw. Gauguin believed the image should come from memory, from imagination, from somewhere behind the eyes rather than in front of them. They argued about this constantly and kept painting anyway. Gauguin cooked. He was a better cook. Van Gogh cleaned. He was not a better cleaner. They visited the local brothels together on evenings when neither of them wanted to be alone with their work, which happened more often as the weeks went on. By early December, Gauguin was writing privately to their mutual friend Émile Bernard that the situation was becoming difficult, and separately to Theo van Gogh, Vincent's brother, and financial lifeline, that he was thinking about leaving. He didn't give specific reasons. The letters are careful in a way that reads, in retrospect, like someone choosing their words. Theo van Gogh worked at the Paris branch of the art dealer Goupil & Cie and had been sending his brother a monthly allowance for years. In exchange for the paintings, Vincent produced an arrangement that was as much about keeping Vincent alive and working as it was about commerce, since Theo had sold almost none of them. They wrote to each other at a frequency that has no real modern equivalent. Over 600 letters survive, and they have the quality not of a correspondence between siblings, but of 2 people who have agreed, without quite saying so, to keep each other together. When Theo was anxious, the letters told Vincent. When Vincent was struggling, the letters told Theo. On the morning of Sunday, the 23rd of December, 1888, a letter arrived at the Yellow House from Paris. Researchers have reconstructed what it most likely contained. News that Theo had become engaged to a Dutch woman named Johanna Bonger. After a courtship so fast, it seems to have surprised both of them. Bernadette Murphy, who spent 11 years in the Arles archives and eventually published the most thorough account of these events, believes this letter, not the tension with Gauguin, or not only that, was the immediate trigger for what followed. Theo's marriage would mean a reorganization of his finances, his attention, his available emotional supply. The monthly letters, the monthly money, the sense that Theo's world turned partly on the axis of Vincent's survival, all of it now subject to revision. What happened that evening between Van Gogh and Gauguin in the Yellow House at 2 Place Lamartine is something that neither man ever fully explained. Gauguin's account, which he set down in a memoir written years later, describes going for a walk to clear his head, hearing footsteps behind him as he crossed the place, Victor Hugo turning to find Van Gogh standing in the lamplight with a razor in his hand. He says he stared at Van Gogh. He says Van Gogh stared back, then turned and walked in the direction of the house. Gauguin went to a hotel. He did not go back to the house. He did not call anyone. He just waited. What happened at the Yellow House after that is known from the evidence found the following morning. blood on the floor, blood on the walls of the bedroom, a quantity of it that left no ambiguity about what kind of night it had been. A razor that had not been cleaned. And on the table, an object wrapped in newspaper and cloth, which Van Gogh had apparently prepared before going out. He walked roughly 100 meters from his front door, through the dark streets of Arles' red light district, what the locals called the Quartier Réservé, to a building near the Roman arena. The brothel was called the Maison de Tolérance No. 1. He arrived at approximately 11:30 in the evening and asked to speak to a woman he knew, or knew of, who worked there. She was not, it turns out, a prostitute. She was a cleaner, a domestic servant who worked at several establishments in the street, cleaning in exchange for room and board. Her name, which researchers had failed to establish for over 100 years, was Gabrielle Berlatier. She was 18 or 19 years old. She was a farmer's daughter from the countryside outside Arles, and she had come to the city some years before, after surviving something that had left permanent scarring on her face. She had been bitten by a dog with rabies in January of 1888 and had travelled to Paris to receive the treatment Louis Pasteur had only recently developed. In January of that same year, Van Gogh was living in Paris. Murphy, who found the medical records that identified Gabrielle, speculates that they may have known each other slightly, or at least known of each other, through the Café de la Gare, the café run by the Genoux family, just down the road from the Yellow House, which Gabrielle is known to have worked at on some days. Van Gogh handed her a package. Inside the newspaper wrapping was his left ear, the entire outer ear, removed at the canal. He said to her in French, "Keep this object carefully." Then he left. Gabrielle fainted. When she recovered, or when someone else in the building recovered for her, the package and its contents were apparently handed over to the police or the hospital. By the time the police arrived at the Yellow House early the next morning, December 24th, Van Gogh was lying unconscious in his bed, his head wrapped in a towel, already soaked through. The commissioner, Joseph d'Ornano, filed a report. An ambulance was called. He was taken to the Hôtel Dieu hospital in Arles, where the doctor on duty was a 23-year-old physician named Félix Rey, 2 years out of medical school, who cleaned and dressed the wound and admitted Van Gogh to the ward. The question of exactly how much of the ear had been removed, a question biographers and medical historians had debated for more than a century, with most settling on the lobe or the lower portion, was settled in 2016, when Murphy, working through an archive in the United States, found a document she had been looking for, without knowing it. It was a letter written by Rey sometime after the events, in which he had made a small sketch in the margin, showing the contours of the injury. The entire outer ear was gone. Rey's sketch, roughly the size of a postage stamp, ended an argument that had been going on since 1888. Theo arrived on Christmas Day, travelling through the night from Paris when he received a telegram. Gauguin left Arles on the same day, or the day after, depending on which source you follow. He and Van Gogh never saw each other again. The relationship between the two men and what actually happened that night has generated a separate argument entirely. In 2001, the German art historians Hans Kaufmann and Rita Wildegans published research arguing that Gauguin had cut off Van Gogh's ear himself with a light fencing sword he was known to carry, during a confrontation that had gone further than either man would later acknowledge. The evidence they assembled included Gauguin's skills as a fencer, the difficulty of self-inflicting a wound of that precision and completeness with a razor, and the fact that both men maintained a careful silence on the precise sequence of events for the rest of their lives. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam has consistently rejected the theory as unsubstantiated. Most scholars agree, but the theory persists, partly because Gauguin's own account, the razor, the lamplight, the stair, the hotel was written down years after the fact, and has the slightly worked quality of a story that someone has been quietly revising in their head for a long time. Van Gogh remained in the Arles hospital through most of January, 1889. Before he left, he painted a portrait of Dr. Rey, a direct, vivid image of a young man in a blue coat with a slightly wary expression, done in the high-contrast complementary colors Van Gogh had been refining all year in Arles. He gave it to Rey as a gesture of thanks. For a period of years, Rey used the canvas to cover a hole in a chicken coop. His family later gave it away, and it passed through several hands before arriving at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, where it has been since 1909. Van Gogh spent the following year at the Saint Paul de Mausole Asylum in Saint-Rémy, 25 kilometers from Arles. He painted there continuously. Cypresses, olive groves, the asylum's enclosed garden, the famous swirling sky over the village of Saint-Rémy that everyone now calls Starry Night. He was lucid for long periods, suffering for shorter ones, and working during both. He moved to Auvers-sur-Oise in the spring of 1890, and on July 27th, he walked into a wheat field and shot himself. He died 2 days later, with Theo at his side. In his lifetime, he sold one painting. The yellow house at 2 Place Lamartine was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid in June 1944. The site is now a traffic junction. Gabrielle Berlatier married a man from the countryside outside Arles, moved away from the city, and lived to the age of 80. She never spoke publicly about the night of the 23rd of December, 1888, and by all accounts never mentioned it to anyone. When Murphy finally tracked down her descendants to ask about her, they had no idea that their grandmother or great-grandmother had once stood in a doorway at 11:30 on a winter night, holding a piece of a dead man's ear, wondering what on earth had just happened.